своем фильме я задавал Станиславу Грофу вопрос, считает ли он себя гуру и человеком, который имеет власть над людьми, над своими пациентами, над читателями книг, над психологами и вообще над массами людей, которым он интересен, которые с ним общаются, которые слушают его лекции. И он сказал, что нет, я не считаю себя гуру, я не считаю себя человеком, у которого есть власть над людьми, и я к этому не стремлюсь. И это говорит лишний раз о его человеческой натуре, о его характере, о его представлении себя в этом мире. И он действительно отличается очень большой душевной теплотой и простотой, которые все-таки свойственны великим людям, потому что я не могу не употребить этот термин «великий человек». И в этом же фильме Тев Спаркс, который работает со Станиславом и который выполняет очень важную миссию организатора конференций, семинаров по холотропному дыханию, ну и вообще очень близок к Станиславу Грофу, тоже человек, не склонный к преувеличениям. Он сказал, что Станислав Гроф — это Зигмунд Фрейд и Карл Юнг в современной эпохе в одном лице. И я думаю, что это правда, потому что психология 21 века, трансперсональная психология, она сама по себе совершила революцию в психологии. И поскольку психология занимается человеческой душой, то и революцию в сознании тысяч, десятков тысяч, сотен тысяч людей, может быть, миллионов людей, которые так или иначе сталкиваются с трансперсональной психологией, с холотропным дыханием и с тем вкладом, который внес Станислав Гроф, внесла Кристина Гроф в понимание того, что же такое человек, какова суть его переживаний, каков смысл его жизни, и что происходит в этом загадочном космосе, который находится в каждом из нас. И есть еще один момент, мне кажется, чрезвычайно важный, который исследует Станислав Гроф и который исследуют очень многие великие просветленные учителя и мастера, с которыми мне приходилось сталкиваться в моей жизни. Как соединить тот космос, который существует внутри нас, с тем космосом бесконечной Вселенной, который существует вне нас. И я недавно вот был снова в Индии, на Кумбхамеле в Харидваре, разговаривал с одним непальским монахом, и я сказал ему: ну объясни вообще, ну все-таки, что такое эго? И он очень просто это сделал. Он взял бутылку воды, а рядом было очень жарко, мы сидели там, он взял бутылку воды и сказал: вот внутри этой бутылки это ты, это твой мир, а за рамками этой бутылки это Вселенная. А вот эта вот пластиковая бутылка — это и есть эго. Это было смешно и в то же время очень понятно, что это такая хрупкая, казалось бы, вещь, прозрачная, но что с ней делать, как с ней работать, оставлять ли это в своей жизни или преодолевать, это тотальные вопросы на самом деле. И в заключение я хотел бы сказать о том, что я благодарен судьбе за встречу с Стэном Грофом. Сначала я был с ним знаком заочно, через Владимира Майкова, и потом мы познакомились, и несколько раз встречались, и каждый раз это были очень важные для меня встречи. Я помню, когда мы приехали в Дублин, и там впервые мы познакомились, снимали семинар по холотропному дыханию, и там у нас было 6 человек, съемочная группа из России, и нужно было заполнять анкету, а всего было человек 100 из разных стран мира, из Америки, из Европы, из Австралии, откуда угодно. Всегда на семинары Стэна Грофа приезжают люди из разных мест Земли. Ну и в этой анкете был вопрос такой: испытываете ли вы в данный момент духовный кризис? А потом, когда подвели итоги, то оказалось, из 100 человек 6 ответили на этот вопрос утвердительно: да, испытывают, и это все были люди из России, из нашей съемочной группы. Поэтому я думаю, что когда Стэн приезжает в нашу страну, а он очень хорошо понимает, что такое славянская загадочная русская душа, потому что он сам чех, и он сам славянин по происхождению, и прожил свою молодость в той самой системе, в которой многие из нас жили. Поэтому он очень хорошо понимает, что такое русская душа. И русские люди, люди, живущие в России, им особенно важно, дорого и ценно то, что делает Станислав Гроф, и те встречи, которые происходят с ним здесь, в нашей стране, в России. Поэтому я считаю, что сегодняшние события, ну, как и все дни Конгресса, вот для меня лично они важны прежде всего потому, что к нам, в нашу страну, очередной раз приехал этот замечательный ученый и очень добрый, очень хороший человек Станислав Гроф.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. When I get this kind of introduction, I feel a little ambivalent, because it's wonderful to get so many strokes and to have so many nice things said about you, but it also creates expectations in the audience that are not easy to live up to. I would like to return the compliment also. Those of us in the transpersonal movement in the United States, we envy Russia, a person in the media like Eduard Sagalayev. That's somebody whom we would like to have in the United States. Unfortunately, the media is not on that level, of openness to spirituality, and I think you've become a real ambassador in that sense. And I felt very close to Eduard since the very first meeting in Ireland, and I think we have created really close friendship, and I appreciate very much the fact that it was you who introduced me today. Okay. There was something I wanted to respond to, which was the question of the guru. I've never seen myself as a guru. I was very lucky to be in a certain place at a certain time when powerful things were happening, when this amazing tool fell into our lap, which was the supply of LSD from Switzerland, from Sandoz, and we started working with this, and suddenly areas are opening in the psyche that psychology and psychiatry didn't know anything about, and I was just fortunate to be there, and basically what I have written in the book was not created by me, but I was collecting experiences of hundreds and then thousands of people, particularly when we started the holotropic breath work. So what you find in my books are not my ideas, my speculations, but I was like a chronicler of non-ordinary states. So I see myself as an explorer, you know. And usually when I talk to people, I don't say this is the way it is, but this is the way how people saw it in these various non-ordinary states of consciousness. And an entirely new way of understanding ourselves and the world emerged out of that. That also happens to be somehow supported by the new developments in science, which we call a new paradigm in science. Okay, so I will start, thank you very much. Yeah. So I will start this morning by actually asking you a few questions, and it's already on the screen. So I would like to ask you, how many of you had in your everyday life any of these kinds of experiences that you see on the screen? Can we see the hands? Okay, well, obviously this is somewhat self-selected audience, but still, it's, you know, it's pretty impressive, and we very much get that kind of response wherever we go. How many of you experience actually the holotropic breathwork that Christina and I developed? Also quite a few. So that really helps. The reason I'm asking that question is that what I will be talking about this morning comes from now over 50 years of systematic study of this particular types of experiences. Now, I used at this point the term non-ordinary states of consciousness, which is a term that those of us who have done some systematic consciousness research have been using. In traditional academic psychiatry, you will hear another term, which is altered states of consciousness, which I personally don't like because it suggests a certain pejorative twist. This is different from the way we should perceive ourselves or should perceive the world. Altered suggests almost impairment or distortion of some sense. In American slang, you use the term for castration of pets. I had my dog altered, I had my cat altered. So I have too much awe and respect to these states to call them altered states. So we were using for a long time the term non-ordinary, but there was also a problem with that. Our daughter is married to a son of Jane Midland Moss, who is a Native American, and we have these wonderful discussions. And she tells me, Stan, I don't know why you are using the term non-ordinary states. For my people, this is just part of the spectrum that human beings can have. So here I think I'm somewhat avant-garde in the academic circle, but for her, coming from a shamanic culture, this is a very narrow way of looking at things, to sort out a certain category of experiences and call them non-ordinary, because we have the natural ability to have those experiences under certain circumstances. So after some time of involvement in the research of these states, I became just astonished that psychiatry and psychology, as we know it today, does not have special name for an important subcategory of non-ordinary states, which are, for example, those that you saw on the screen, that have actually healing, transformative, and even evolutionary potential. We call them all altered states, and they're seen as pathological states. So I decided to create my own term, and I started calling this important subcategory of these non-ordinary states holotropic states. So those would be the states that shamans experience during their initiatory crisis, or the states that they induce in their clients when they are doing healing work with them. Holotropic states are states experienced by native cultures in what's called rites of passage or some other powerful native ceremonies. These are the states that have been described by initiates in the ancient mysteries of death and rebirth. The mysteries, Sumerian mysteries of Inanna and Tammuz, or the experiences of initiates in the Isis-Osiris mysteries in Egypt, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Bacchanalia, the mysteries of Attis, Adonis, in Mesoamerica, the mysteries of Xibalba, of the Mayans, and so on. And also the experiences that were described by Buddhists of different schools, by yogis, by Taoists, by Christian mystics, by Kabbalists, and so on. So these all would be called, in this new terminology, holotropic. And they're quite different from other states that actually deserve the term altered, which is like a delirium that you have when you have typhoid fever, or delirium tremens, and so on. Those are very, very different. These are experiences that are healing, that are transformative, that are evolutionary, and they have very powerful heuristic potential. That's H-E-U-R, from Eureka, which means you can get a lot of new information from these states about consciousness, about the human psyche in health and disease, and even about the nature of reality. So what does that term holotropic means? It's a composite word, it's a neologism that you don't find anywhere else than in my writings or people who write something that's based, because this was my term. Holos means whole, and trepein means moving in the direction of something. Like in the term heliotropism, helios is sun, trepein again, moving in the direction of something. So if you have a plant, it tends to orient itself towards the sun, follow the sun, move in the direction of the sun. Now, that term suggests something that surprises many Westerners in the, or I would say, if we are in Russia, I would expand it and say in the industrial civilization. It suggests that we somehow are not whole the way we experience ourselves. We experience ourselves in the ordinary state of consciousness as being Newtonian objects and having an ego, so we are body egos. Now, it suggests something different, and I would actually refer to yesterday's lecture to Dr. Karan Singh. What it suggests that we are not what we are experiencing ourselves as in everyday life. The Hindus would say we are not nama rupa, we are not name and shape. We carry inside of ourselves a kind of a divine core, divine sparks. And in the Hindu tradition you would get practices. And when you pursue those practices, this becomes then a direct experience. This is not a belief, some kind of an ungrounded, unsubstantiated statement, but it's an empirical thing. If you follow those procedures, that's the experience that you can have. You reach a kind of a divine core within yourself, Atman, and when you have that experience, you realize that that energy and that absolute consciousness which is there is really identical with the creative energy of the universe. That Atman, Brahman. So we are not Nama Rupa, we are Atman, Brahman. And this is something that you find, of course, in the Upanishads, when there's a question, who are you, who are we? And the answer would be in Sanskrit, Tattvam Asi. which is usually translated in archaic language, thou art that. You are it, with a capital E, means you are Godhead. You are not an ordinary human being the way you are experiencing yourself. Teilhard de Chardin, the French paleontologist and Jesuit priest, had a different way of saying. He said, we are not human beings having spiritual experiences. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. And if you look at this, you'll find out that similar statement is at the core of all major religions. So you could just as well say cosmic Christ, Allah, the Tao, Sila, and so on. So this is the basic idea behind the term holotropic. So my own entry into this realm of holotropic experiences was in 1956, where as a beginning psychiatrist, I volunteered for an LSD session. We got a supply of LSD, which was just, had been discovered and explored in Switzerland, and it was offered for psychiatrists as a kind of a training, very unconventional training experience. The early study of Dr. Stoll showed that there was some similarity between the experiences of people who get the diagnosis of psychosis and the experiences induced by LSD. So they were now sending samples of the substance to different research institutes and universities and individual therapists, and they were asking for feedback. Can you see any use for the substance in psychiatry? And they suggested basically two different uses. One of them was to use LSD as what they called model psychosis, experimental psychosis. You can have a group of quote-unquote normal people. You can do all kinds of examinations, and then you give LSD, and you repeat the examinations, and you find out what's happening biologically at the time when the psyche of these people is so profoundly changed. And then there was a second suggestion that kind of became my destiny, which was that this substance could possibly be used as an unconventional training tool for psychiatrists and psychologists who would have the chance to spend several hours in the world that seems to have something in common with the world of our patients. And it would make it possible for us to understand our patients better, to communicate with them more effectively, and hopefully be more successful in their treatment, which was something that we really very sorely needed. And so, I became one of the early Czech volunteers, and I had an extremely powerful experience of cosmic consciousness. It was actually an experiment where my preceptor was interested in electroencephalography, and more specifically in driving of the brain waves, which means exposing people to powerful stroboscopic lights and finding out if the corresponding areas of the brain would pick up the frequency that you're feeding in. So I not only had this powerful psychoactive substance, LSD, but at the height of it, I was exposed to this stimulation, and it just catapulted me completely out of my body, and I had the feeling I became one with everything there was. And I came down from that session extremely impressed. And that time I was quite disappointed with psychoanalysis, which was the reason why I went to psychiatry in the first place. And suddenly this opened a whole new area. I said, I'm already stuck with psychiatry, and if you're a psychiatrist, this is by far the most interesting thing you can do, study these states that I call now holotropic. So I started experimenting with it, and my worldview was constantly challenged. I was observing and then also experiencing things that simply were not supposed to be happening if the world were the way it's described by traditional science, by academic psychiatry and psychology. And it was a real crisis, to the point that I, questioned my sanity, because what I was experiencing was against everything that I was taught by authorities, by people who were university professors. If you are a medical student and a beginning psychiatrist, you have a lot of sort of awe and respect to authorities. And these were things that simply were not possible if the universe was the way I was taught. We talk these days about anomalous experiences. So we saw a lot of anomalous experiences, paradigm challenges, things that require major revision in our thinking. So when I became comfortable with this whole world of these anomalous phenomena, I started writing books about what I believed were implications for different aspects of psychiatry, for the dimensions of the psyche themselves. How big is the psyche? What kind of experiences can you have without getting psychiatric diagnosis? The implications for the strategy of psychotherapy. And then at the very end of the spectrum, actually implications for the nature of reality, particularly one significant aspect, which is what is consciousness? Is it really true that consciousness can be explained as something that emerges out of the complexity of neurophysiological processes? Or is consciousness something much more fundamental? When I was approaching my 70th birthday, I was planning to at least semi-retire and do sort of more reading and writing. And we had holotropic breathwork training all over the world. We had now very capable staff of people who were teaching holotropic breathwork all over the world. And we needed a manual so that people in these different countries, teach at least similar things. And I got a call from my editor from State University New York Press, who published quite a few of my books. And she said, we have published books on different aspects of your work. Would you consider putting it all into one book? Would you summarize it and create a book that would be kind of an introduction for the readers to all the other books? And I said, I would consider it. And then she said, well, and would you specifically focus on your observations that current psychiatry and psychology cannot explain? I said, okay. And then there was a little pause, and then she said, and would you suggest what this new psychiatry and psychology would look like that would actually accommodate these new observations, the revisions that would have to be made? Well, this is something that we call in America a tall order, But I got excited about it because here was an offer to write a manual for our training. Basically, put chapters there that would be the topics of the different training modules, as we call it. So I sat down and I wrote the book, and I decided to give it a very provocative title, Psychology of the Future. This is psychology of the future. Okay. Why I say deliberately provocative. If you write a book with titles like The Holotropic Mind and so on, people just can ignore it. If you say this is the psychology of the future, people either get excited or they get very provoked. They get sort of irritated. So it's a kind of an attention-getting tool. So that's a book that we are now using in the training. And as you saw, we have now published another book which actually describes the training itself, not the theoretical implications only, but the methodology of the holotropic breathwork. So let's see if I can get the. Can we have the second slide? Okay. Můžete mě dát druhou kartinku? Okay. Okay, what you will see is a list of categories where I believe we would have to think radically our thinking, change radically our thinking in psychiatry and psychology. It's a major reform that we will be talking about. This is not something that can be handled by small patchwork, what we call technically ad hoc hypothesis. This would be a major overhaul. I mean, we would have radically changed our understanding. In about a week, I will start the 80th year of my life, and this is where people frequently, researchers, try to summarize what they have seen during their lifetime. Thank you. Now, in the past, people who suggested something, this radical, did not have a very good time. They were not sort of embraced enthusiastically by the academia, and I wouldn't expect it because I know how difficult it was for me to accept my own observations. But I will take my chances. So these are the different areas where we would have to change our thinking very, very radically. I will actually start with the nature of consciousness itself. If you study psychology, psychiatry, you'll be told that consciousness somehow mysteriously emerges out of the complexity of the processes in the brain. Now, to my knowledge, nobody has ever attempted to explain how something like this could happen. The gap between matter and consciousness is so phenomenal, so profound, that you don't even know where to start thinking about how something like this could happen. So we are basically dealing with a metaphysical assumption. This is based on a metaphysical assumption that this is a material world. The history of the universe is a history of developing matter. And the universe created somehow itself. And what happened there, the origin of organic matter, life, consciousness, intelligence, this all happened by bouncing of the particles without any guiding intelligence. Now, if you work with holotropic states, you will find out that consciousness is something very, very different. It is at least an equal partner of matter, potentially, possibly supraordinated. I can, after half a century of experiencing these states and working with them, it's much easier for me to imagine that the material world is a virtual reality created by consciousness, by orchestration of experiences, than it is to believe that matter can generate something as phenomenal as consciousness. So we have now, enormous number of observations indicating that consciousness can do things that the brain cannot possibly do. In a variety of transpersonal experiences, and I don't have time for many examples today, but you would find it in my books, where we can leave somehow the boundaries of the body ego, or what Alan Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego, and we can become aspects of the world at large. We can become other people, we can experience group consciousness, we can experience identification with animals, we can go into human history. And in these experiences, we get new information about these different aspects of the world that we have never had in this lifetime. We had not acquired it through our senses. I will just sort of sort out one particular experience that you're all familiar with. I'm sure you have read about it many times. And that's the evidence from thanatology. It's the science that studies death and dying. So there's now enormous evidence showing that it is possible to be clinically dead, and not just because the heart stopped, but because now you have flat EEG, you have no brain activity. And as you are in that state, biologically, physiologically, your consciousness leaves the body and maybe settles for a place near the ceiling and kind of observes with a detached interest what's happening to the body, and then maybe decides to go for a little excursion and go and checks what's happening in other parts of the building, and then maybe has an experience that's happening somewhere 2,000 miles away. Now, if you're a traditional physician or psychiatrist, you say, well, those are hallucinations. You know, the dying brain is sort of producing some kind of images there. But if you are an open-minded researcher and you go and you check what was actually happening in those places that the person is talking about, you get what we call consensual validation. These are veridical out-of-body experiences, kind of an astral projection type of experiences. We have now literature by Ken Rink and his co-workers showing that this same thing can happen to people who are blind, congenitally blind for organic reasons. They've never seen anything in their entire lifetime, and when they are in a near-death situation and consciousness leaves the body, that person can perceive the environment. Checks the fixtures, can describe the fixtures on the ceiling, and then maybe go through the ceilings of the hospital and get a bird's eye view of the hospital, and things like that. So those are very, very radical observations, and it's amazing that this is generally known. I would expect with people like Vladimir Maikov and Eduard Sagalayev that this was, also in the Russian television and Russian media, but certainly in the United States, there are best-selling books on the New York bestseller list of people who describe what happened to them when they were in a near-death situation. There are books by thanatologists describing what they observed. Talk shows, people coming and talking on television about the experiences that they had in near-death situations. Hollywood people are inspired. Any number of movies now describes what happened to people after they die. And so people on the street know that, but somehow the academic circles don't respond to that. And they act as if nothing changed, and we are still teaching in our universities that consciousness is something that is produced by the brain. There's something actually called in the history vulgar materialism. Lametrie, who said there's nothing special about consciousness. The brain produces consciousness like the kidneys produce urine. That's the sort of extreme kind of materialistic statement about consciousness, which I find just absolutely preposterous. Okay, so this is what we learned about consciousness. Now then the second one is dimensions of the human psyche. What we have in current psychiatry and psychology is basically the model of the psyche limited to postnatal biography. Freud said the newborn is a tabula rasa, the newborn is a clean slate. There is nothing that's of any interest for a psychologist that precedes birth, including birth itself. So who we become psychologically depends on what kind of mother we had, what kind of nursing, what happened during toilet training, various psychosexual traumas, how he handled the Oedipus and the Electra situation, and so on. And then we have the Freudian individual unconscious, which is also a derivative of postnatal history, things that we have forgotten, things that we have repressed, things that we found unacceptable. Freud actually, after he discovered this individual unconscious, he used that image of the submerged iceberg. He says, what we thought the psyche was is really just the tip of the iceberg, and there is this enormous part of the psyche which is unconscious. This was very much kind of the understanding that I had of the psyche when I started working with psychedelics. And on some superficial level of the psychedelic experience, it seemed that that was the case. In some sense, it was actually almost like laboratory confirmation of the Freudian model. Only the problem was that the experiences didn't stay there, and as we were continuing with the sessions or increasing the dosages, suddenly new areas of the psyche were opening up that Freud and his followers, with the exception of the renegades like Otto Rank or Carl Gustav Jung, were not aware of, they didn't know anything about. So the first major area that opened up was an area that I now call perinatal. The term perinatal is used in obstetrics and describes situations that happen immediately before birth, during birth, and immediately following birth. But you don't read in obstetrics anything about perinatal experiences. We talk about perinatal brain hemorrhage, perinatal damage, perinatal infection. Because in psychiatry and in medicine in general, and also philosophy, Western philosophy, we have the idea that somehow we cannot have a memory of birth. In biology and physiology, the explanation for this is given by referring to what's called myelinization of the brain. The neurons are normally covered by kind of a fatty substance called myelin, and this process, myelinization, is not completed in a newborn baby. And that's given as a kind of authoritative reason why there couldn't be any memory of birth. Now, there's just an amazing sort of a logical error, if you think about it, because there's general agreement in psychiatry, psychology, pediatrics, and so on, that immediately after birth, there is consciousness, and what happens to the baby there can influence the whole subsequent life. So obstetricians, for example, talk about bonding, that just the exchange of looks between the mother and the child and the contact between the mother and the child can determine the whole future of the relationship between the individual and the mother. So that same argument, obviously when you're born, the brain doesn't suddenly myelinize. So the baby who emerges from the birth canal still has that cerebral cortex that's not myelinized. But while it was not able to record birth, suddenly it becomes capable of recording subtleties of nursing. Now, we also have a lot of prenatal research now, people like Tomatis and so on, showing extreme sensitivity of the fetus already in the womb. You play Vivaldi to pregnant mothers, and then you play the same music in the nursery, and the children do better, they sleep better, they gain more weight, and so on. It becomes a kind of a comforting environment because of that connection with the prenatal state. Another thing that you have to consider, you don't need a brain at all, let alone a myelinized brain, to have memories. Memories exist in life forms that don't have any brain at all. Actually, I think about 10 years ago or so, Eric Kandel was given a Nobel Prize for studying memory mechanism in a sea slug, a snail, kind of sea snail, called aplysia. So you get a Nobel Prize for studying the memory mechanisms in a sea slug, but the newborn, you know, it's on a totally different level of evolution, is not able to record something that could have been, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50 hours of a life-threatening situation. So we have this interesting situation where there's obviously powerful psychological suppression. I mean, that the memory of that experience is so scary that we just don't want to go there, and we use our intellect to explain it away. Says, oh, this couldn't have mattered. My cortex was not myelinized. So that's one major area that you have to add to the model of the psyche, not just postnatal biography, but now the perinatal domain, and actually quite specific kind of experiences associated with the consecutive stages of birth. I talk about them as basic perinatal matrices, being in the womb before anything starts, then the situation where the uterus contracts but the cervix is not open, kind of a no exit situation, then the situation where the cervix opens and there's a struggle to get out, and then the coming out of the birth canal itself. So these are four very distinct experiential matrices that you can have in holotropic states when you come to that level of the unconscious. And then we have another domain, vast domain, that we have to add to the cartography of the psyche, and we call it now transpersonal. So those would be some of the experiences that I already mentioned. You can suddenly become one with another person, or you can become actually another person. You can experience group consciousness. You can experience that you became all mothers of the world, or all children of the world, or all warriors of the world. Or you can experience the field of consciousness itself. You can go into the animal realm. I already mentioned you can experience anything from the Darwinian evolutionary tree. You can identify with any other life form, and you get a new information about that life form that you never acquired through your senses in this particular lifetime. It could even be identification with something in the botanical world, with a sequoia tree, with a carnivorous plant, and so on. You can experience yourself as a tree and have conscious experience of photosynthesis, or the exchange of minerals and water in the root system, and the circulation of the sap, where your body image becomes the body image of a tree rather than a human body image. Now there's a situation here where anything that in your ordinary state of consciousness you experience as an object seems to have a corresponding subjective state of mind. So you can again connect this to the great spiritual philosophies of India, where you would hear that everything that we experience is actually a manifestation of Brahma. It's creation of absolute consciousness. The idea that the world is solid and material and Newtonian would be called Maya, or the Hindu religion would talk about Lila. What we experience is a play of the divine. It's a play of consciousness. There's another category of transpersonal experiences that can take you into the historical or the archetypal domain of the Jungian collective unconscious. You can experience anything that has ever happened in history, at least potentially, and you can also, in the archetypal realm, experience any archetypal figures, any archetypal domains of any culture that has ever existed, whether or not you know anything about these mythologies or about these periods of human history intellectually. We have now a wonderful scientific model for this, which I really recommend to those of you who would like to bridge what I'm now saying to hard science, and that's the work of Erwin Laszlo. Quite amazing, the concept of the psi field, PSI, or what he now calls actually Akashic field, and really tying it specifically to the spiritual traditions. So this is now the image of the psyche that we should have to accommodate these anomalous phenomena that we experience. Now we can look at architecture of emotional and psychosomatic disorders. In traditional academic psychiatry, if you have any emotional and psychosomatic problems that are not organic, they don't have a biological basis, the idea is that somehow they develop postnatally. And traditional psychoanalysis gave you actually the references to the periods of life where you would expect the origin of these emotional and psychosomatic problems. Let's say alcoholism, addiction, manic depressive disorders would be oral. Obsessive compulsive neurosis would mean anal fixation on the anal stage of libidinal development. Phobias and classical conversion hysteria would be linked to what Freud called the phallic, around 4 years of age, when you also deal with the Electra and the Oedipus problems and so on. If you work with holotropic states and you are working on one of these issues, you will definitely find something in your individual history that will more or less confirm that there is a significant connection to your postnatal life, to infancy and childhood. The problem is that it's not all there is there. You'll find if you have a way of going deeper, you find deeper roots for the same problems, and this would be on the perinatal level, linked to one of the perinatal matrices, and there would be actually roots for those problems reaching deep into the transpersonal level. At the bottom of that could be a karmic experience. At the bottom of it could be some kind of an archetypal motif. It can take you to some phylogenetic roots of this. Just a quick example. You're working on psychogenic asthma, okay? You regress and you find out that significant part of the choking in asthma is an unfinished business related to a near drowning experience when you were 7. Then you go and you find some additional components which are related to being repeatedly choked by your older brother. You go deeper, there is choking when you had whooping cough when you were 2 years old. And then you find significant deep root in the birth process. Birth, a significant element of choking. And then you can, at the bottom, you can find an experience where strangling or hanging or something like this seemed to have happened in another historical period, and you would experience it as a remnant of one of your past lives. Now we can get to the next one, which is the therapeutic mechanisms. Now what I just said would sound like a very bad news. You know, we thought we just had to work on our infancy and childhood, and suddenly the playground is much, much larger. Now the good news is that you also would discover powerful mechanisms of healing and transformation that exist on the perinatal level and on the transpersonal level. For example, reliving birth, processing the emotions, expressing the pent-up energies that we carry from birth can alleviate a whole range of different emotional and psychosomatic problems. For example, claustrophobia is one of these kinds of deep depression. There's a lot of violence associated, aggressive response to birth that is recorded there. Things like headaches, I already mentioned asthma and so on. So if you now relive birth and you process the energies and the emotions, this could really alleviate a whole range, whole spectrum of problems. And there are also very powerful mechanisms on the transpersonal level. For example, we have found in many instances that major therapeutic changes happened after people relived what they felt was a past life experience. Or the problem would be aggression and violence, and a lot of it would come through in identification. It was a feline predator. Identification was a black panther or a tiger, and so on. And very powerful healing mechanism could be allowing an archetypal figure or an archetypal motif to emerge into consciousness, including demonic energy, when the experience then looks very much like exorcism, and when that energy emerges. Okay, then we have the next one, which would be the strategy of psychotherapy and self-exploration. Extremely important. If you look at the world of psychotherapy, you'll find any number of schools. Okay, each school would tell you something very different. There's fundamental disagreements as to what are the basic motivating forces of the psyche. Each school has a different answer. Why do symptoms emerge? What do those symptoms mean? How and when do you interpret? So if you have a problem, you can just flip a coin and choose a school, and with each school comes a different explanation of what is wrong with you. But then also, each of those schools would give you a different technique. How do you work with your clients? How do you interpret? What kind of therapeutic maneuvers would you be using? And that fundamental disagreement or lack of agreement is very disconcerting. At least it was for me. But we somehow, as a profession, we kind of managed to live with it. You know, also when, as beginning psychologists and psychiatrists, we are choosing a school. You know, we don't have any objective evidence that one school is more effective than another. So when we choose a school, it tells more about us than about the school. Like for me, it was Freud. You know, wow, Freud, that's where it's at. This is where I'm going to get my training. And this is what we do. And when it doesn't work for us, when we are not quite satisfied, we just go and get a training with another school. So there are people who have been, you know, to 10 different trainings. But then the question is, when you have a real patient, how do you choose which particular approach? The person is presenting a dream. You know, what do you do? Do you do Fritz Perls? Do you do Jungian interpretation? Do you do Freudian interpretation, and so on? If this were true, that intellectual understanding of the psyche in general and the psyche of a specific client in particular would really be the key to therapy, what we would have to have is the therapeutic results would be distributed on something like a Gaussian curve. There would be one school that has most accurate understanding of the psyche, and they would get most of the results because their interpretations would be right on. And then those that would be departing from quote-unquote correct understanding would be distributed on those declining branches of that Gaussian curve. And that doesn't happen. You know, some of the studies that were done showed something different. It's really difficult to show any statistically significant difference between the efficacy of the schools. But you certainly find differences within the schools. Each school has better therapists and not so good therapists. And, you know, we know that. And it's very likely that what's effective in therapy is something that it's not described in the theory of that therapy. And it would be something that's very difficult to describe scientifically, like the quality of the human encounter between the patient and the client, the feeling of the client to be understood by another human being and accepted by another human being, typically for the first time in their lives, because they didn't get it in their own nuclear family. feeling sort of important, you know, feeling to be a focus of attention and so on. But also in my understanding, being in therapy and feeling the support of the therapeutic process gives you much more tolerance for what's emerging from your unconscious. So you allow some actually inner healing mechanisms to take place and unfold, where if you did not have that support, you would be much more frightened and sort of disquieted by what you're finding in your unconscious. Whereas now when the stuff's coming, you are kind of saving it for as material for your therapy. It gives you much more tolerance for what is happening inside of you. Now, what did we learn in the work with holotropic states? It's actually something that Jung already suggested. For Jung, the psyche, at least at the end of his life, was not something that was inside of the skull. After he studied synchronicity and the archetypes, you see, were cosmic organizing principles, and they were influencing the world, and also the psyche, and the psyche itself became something enormous. The psyche was anima mundi, the psyche of the universe, was the universal mind, and our individual psyche is partaking, is kind of teased out of this cosmic matrix, and the boundaries are very relative and negotiable. In holotropic states, we can step out of what we perceive as our individual psyche, and we can experience the universe at large. There's a wonderful saying that you find in Victor Hugo, Les Miserables, where he says, there is one spectacle which is grander than the ocean, and that's the heavens. And there is one spectacle which is greater than the heavens, and that's the human psyche, the human soul. And unlike Freud, Jung was able to see the human psyche as a mystery. So the intellect is just a partial function of the psyche. It has no way to understand the psyche. The psyche is a mystery, as much as being is a mystery. The fact that we are here, that anything is here. Why there is existence rather than non-existence. The reason doesn't, the intellect doesn't help us very much with these kinds of fundamental questions. So Jung's idea was you cannot understand intellectually the psyche of your patients or the psyche in general and come up with some tricks, you know, to fix the person. But what you can do, you can create a kind of a supportive container. Jung was very interested in alchemy, so you can think about it as hermetic vessel where transfiguration, transformation will happen, and then offer the client a way that makes it possible for the conscious ego to communicate with a higher aspect of the client, himself or herself, which Jung would call self, which in English would be with capital S. And the healing happens in the kind of an interplay or a dialectic exchange between the conscious ego and the client's own higher self. It's the inner healer that's guiding the process. It's not the therapist who has this understanding and comes with these great sort of interpretations. So Jung's description, the late description of the therapist was co-adventurer, not the fixer. Therapeutes in Greek means somebody who is intelligently participating in the healer process. It's not the healer, it's not the doer, it's not the fixer. So in the work with holotropic states, you create this supportive environment, this hermetic vessel, then you offer some method that makes it possible to go into a holotropic state. For Jung, it was active imagination, allowing the client to continue the dream on the couch and work with the material in statu nascendi as it was emerging. But it could be shamanic methods, it could be psychedelics, it could be the breathing. You know, there are many ways you can do it. And once the person is in the holotropic state, you just support what is unfolding. You don't come in with an intention of what you want to do as a therapist. It's quite difficult for many people who have traditional training to be there in this kind of a position of a midwife rather than the surgeon, you see, the one who's sort of fixing the person. Okay. The role of spirituality in traditional science, we have the idea, again, that this is a material universe. See, the history of the universe, the history of developing matter. And as I mentioned before, life, consciousness, intelligence are kind of more or less accidents in the evolution of the universe. Something that happened in an insignificant part of this enormous universe that has billions of galaxies. It's basically a fluke. So if you have this kind of understanding of the material understanding of the universe, there's no place for spirit. What is spirit? Where does spirit come from? So from a strictly materialistic point of view, quote unquote scientific, I would say scientistic point of view, if you are spiritual, there's something wrong with you. At best, you just don't know your science. You just haven't learned what science discovered about this universe. You are superstitious. You are into magical thinking. If you are intelligent, then you have some problem from your childhood. You still carry some infantile images of your parents, the way you saw your parents as deities, and now you sort of project those images and you make gods and goddesses from them. And if you have actual spiritual experiences in today's psychiatry, you get a diagnosis, and that process would be stopped. Now, if you work with holotropic states, you find out something different, that as the process of regression into your psyche reaches at least the perinatal level, a new dimension comes into your experience, which Jung called luminosity. Actually used Rudolf Otto's term. And he liked it better than calling it sacred, holy, mystical, and so on, because these kinds of terms have been used in many different contexts, and they could easily be misunderstood. Whereas the term luminous is nice and neutral. But what it means is that suddenly you have experiences that have a quality that you don't know from your everyday life, except maybe from some moments where you had sort of deep experiences when you were looking at the Himalayas or the Grand Canyon or the Aurora Borealis, or you listened to that, and you might have gotten a touch of that. So the images from the deeper level of the psyche have the sense of luminosity. You suddenly understand that they belong to a higher order of reality that actually forms and informs what is happening here. So if somebody is atheistic, that means that that person has not experienced himself or herself to sufficient depth to discover the luminosity of their own psyche, and through that also the presence of the luminous dimension in reality itself. Aurobindo's definition of an atheist was God playing hide and seek with himself, herself. Okay, I will now go to the last part, which was actually the greatest surprise that I experienced. I mean, as you can imagine, for somebody traditionally trained, I mean, this was enough. But there came something that was much more fundamental, much more difficult to integrate, and that was the discovery of amazing, extraordinary predictive power of correctly understood astrology. And that was the most difficult somehow for me to accept, because to include somehow astrology, and I mean scientific astrology, into your worldview, you have to really radically sort of change your understanding of yourself and reality. You cannot add it to what you think you are, or what you think reality is. I don't think I would have actually even mentioned it today if it were not for the fact that we have Rick Tarnas with us. And we have worked together for 30 years from the time when we met at SLN, paying attention to these correlations. Is Rick here? No, okay. He has heard this many, many times. So very early, when we lived at SLN, we had a situation where a man came, Arne Tretevik, who walked around constantly carrying the ephemeris and was looking at his life and studying hour by hour what was happening in his life and what was happening around him and how it was correlated with the transit. And he came to us and he says, "You're studying these non-ordinary states, why don't you use astrology? That would be a wonderful guide." And we said, "Astrology, you know." But we were sort of sufficiently interested to sit down, and he taught us some of the basics of astrology and how to do a chart and so on. And we started looking at people who had very powerful experiences. And SLN is like a human laboratory. I mean, there was a lot of powerful transformation happening. You know, people doing various forms of experiential psychotherapy and having spiritual emergencies and psychotic breaks and so on. And Rick at the time was in the guard check, and he was also a night guard, spending a lot of time with the big sky, which is just amazing. And we started noticing some amazing correlations. The first one was that what I described as the phenomenology of these four matrices could be descriptions of astrological archetypes. The first one being in the womb, which is sort of the oceanic, cosmic kind of experience. When you have that experience and it's spelled out, you could just as well be reading about Neptune, the archetype of Neptune. The second one, when you have compression, oppression, depression, starvation, guilt, this would be reading from an astrological book that would involve the archetype of Saturn. Then the third one, when you are struggling through the birth canal, and there is also powerful energy generated that has kind of a sexual quality about it. So in this matrix you have birth, sex, death, rebirth, sexuality, and also elimination. There could be encounter with different forms of biological material. This would be the archetype of Pluto. And then you have the fourth matrix, which is breaking out, sudden, unexpected resolution of a difficult situation, divine epiphany, you know, the influx of new breakthroughs and insights and so on, would be the Uranus archetype. And then later, it became obvious that not only is there this fundamental correlation with the matrices, but that people actually would have experiences of these archetypes at the time when they have the corresponding transits. This would be a whole other talk. I have to leave it here, and actually this would be talk that should be given by Rick, not by myself. We created a kind of a team where I was mostly the one who was bringing experiences, you know, people from holotropic breathwork, people who had psychedelic sessions, spiritual emergencies, psychotic breaks, and of course continued, you know, exploring the healing, the transformative, the heuristic potential of non-ordinary states. But Rick became a full-time astrologer, and so what I know of astrology is what rubbed off on, during this cooperation. But if you are really interested, Rick is doing a postnatal seminar here, and what did I say? Oh, okay. post conference seminar. So he did meticulous research that took 30 years before he wrote this book, Cosmos and Psyche, which I understand is now or will be coming out in a Russian translation. So you'll be able to study that. It is an intellectual challenge to integrate real astrology, but I believe today that the future of psychotherapy would be in responsible work with these holotropic states of consciousness. By this I don't mean just the breath work, but that whole spectrum of non-ordinary states that I was talking about, and combined with archetypal psychology, and then using transit astrology as a guide. And I'm aware how challenging, how absurd this might sound, to people who have academic training. But I will just put it out there because this is really my present conviction. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience, and it's great to be given this opportunity. Okay, we will have a panel discussion where we will go a little more into the relationship between this kind of material and transpersonal psychology in general and new paradigm. How you can somehow try to bridge this and bring some of the new advances in science that actually support some of the transpersonal perspectives. Obviously what you heard is completely incompatible with 17th century sort of Cartesian Newtonian thinking, but you can find very important connections to different avenues of what's called the new or the emerging paradigm. Okay. Break. Thanks again, Eduard, for wonderful